Gothic Architecture by Maddie Petty, Haley Mason, Grace Pico, Cordelia Gardner, and Alyssa Potter. Gothic is a pejorative term to refer medieval architecture coined by Renaissance architects and scholars. It is relating to the Goths, and it was considered barbaric during this time period. The building on the left is the Milan Cathedral. It is the largest church in Italy and the fifth largest church in the world. General importance of Gothic architecture is found in design principles, cultural symbolism, and enduring legacy in the history of art and architecture today. It is important because it refers to a style of medieval European architecture that developed out of Romanesque styles, and it eventually gave way to the Renaissance styles, which we will talk about later. The importance of Gothic architects are that they broke away from the heavy and solid structure of the Romanesque style, which used more of like a lighter touch with intricate detailing. And Abbot Suger pushed boundaries with pointed arches, flying buttresses, ribbed vaults, and tall stained glass windows, as you can see in the images represented. Architects also shaped cities like Notre Dame, which became an important symbol in religion. The building on the left is the Notre Dame de Paris Cathedral. It houses numerous significant religious and historical artifacts, such as the crown of thorns worn by Jesus during the crucifixion. And the building on the left is the Basilica Cathedral of St. Denis, which becomes the prototype of Christian cathedrals from the 20th century onwards. The importance of the High Gothic developments are the symbolic representations of religious stories shown in a lot of the glass facades in Gothic architecture, such as the sun moving across the sky and the colored light filtered into the cathedral. The High Gothic innovations achieved Suger's goal of an illuminated interior flooded with light. He considered this like the closest thing to heaven on earth during this time. The shift of adding more light into these architectural buildings and the language was a radical innovation for that time. It helped with spatial awareness in architecture. The building on the right is the Amiens Cathedral. It is one of the largest classic Gothic churches of the 13th century.
Okay, so for this slide, I am answering which were the most visible authors/actors of the period studied and why. So to answer this question, I'm going to talk about Abbot Suger. He was really the only author that stuck out to me and that we really talked about during the Gothic era. Suger was born in 1081 and he died January 13th, 1151. He was a French statesman, but he was also best known as the Gothic architect and historian. Fun fact about Suger is that his parents were peasants and no one really knows where his parents were from. One thing that we learned in the class was that he supervised and helped rebuild the Basilica Cathedral of St. Denis. And he was a French advisor for King Louis VI and VII to help rebuild the Basilica. So for this slide, we're going to talk about Abbot's connection with the Basilica Cathedral of St. Denis. Abbot Suger's innovative renovation of St. Denis was in the 1100s. He laid the foundation for the great Gothic cathedrals of France. It also inspired the Notre Dame Cathedral as well. Suger wrote the Livius de Consecration Ecclesia Estoyance. Although this book was closer to an administrative diary than an architectural treaty, the theological and aesthetic foundation of Gothic architecture was formulated and presented by Suger. And to answer the second question of this slide, it was why Abbot Suger was the most visible author of the Gothic era. And Suger really set the tone for the Gothic era. He reconstructed the Basilica Cathedral. Suger added stained glass. which added a new creation to churches that really contained to light, and he states that light would brighten the minds of his congregation, leading to the true light where Christ is the true door. And other big things that he introduced to the Gothic era was pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses.
There are many elements that help us recognize and synthesize Gothic architecture. The main elements of Gothic architecture are buttress or flying buttresses, the triforium and clerestory, the rose window, pointed arches, and ribbed vaulting. Buttresses and flying buttresses are key structural elements in Gothic architecture that support the walls and vaulted ceiling weight in large cathedrals and religious buildings. The solid support structure of buttresses help to distribute the weight of the building and allow for a thinner framework for painted glass and window space. While buttresses appear in more Romanesque style architecture, flying buttresses are more sophisticated and seen in Gothic architecture. Triforium and clerestory are usually seen near each other on the walls of Gothic architecture. The triforium is a structural element with lots of detail. The narrow passages create gaps for the carvings and designs to be visible. The clerestory is above the triforium on the upper section of the wall. It is also a structural piece that is very detailed. The clerestory emphasizes the natural lighting of the space with room for glass panels and windows. The rose window is one of the most popular or iconic elements of Gothic architecture. As a decorative element, rose windows also highlight the power of natural light and shine into the cathedrals. The circular windows, which resemble flowers, hence the name rose window, are crafted with painted glass that depict biblical scenes and colorful geometric patterns. The light and colors illuminate the spaces around them. Pointed arches are another element of Gothic architecture that reflect the shift from Romanesque to Gothic style buildings. While Roman arches are more round, Gothic arches or pointed arches echo the intersection of two circles. The pointed detail mimics the language of ceilings and add detail to the facade. The ribbed vaulting is a Gothic element common in architecture. The space it provides allows for the lightness of the framework to shine. Gothic architecture finds significance in the thin framework and light structure that past architecture styles did not produce. Ribbed vaulting works with the other elements around it to add detail and follow the design patterns that surround the cathedrals. Many other elements of Gothic architecture, including the transept, the pinnacles, nave arches, and aisles. These elements, and the ones we just discussed, help people identify Gothic architecture and its beauty from both the time it was most popular and today.
So I'm going to talk about the developments that promoted the Gothic style. Gothic era began in the 12th century, developing in France first from the early Romanesque style, and it began with the Goth tribe, who were a German nomadic group that battled the Romans from 300 to 400 AD. And this marked the beginning of the medieval period, according to Arc Daily. And when the Roman Empire fell, the Goths held the power, and they brought new styles of architecture, new influence on art, making statues and paintings and portraits and things like that. And they also held a lot of social influence from the Arabs who were near them and who were trading all around them. So socially, the Christians were moving into the High Middle Ages. They were experiencing new population growth with new arts, and then later it would lead to the 12th century Renaissance. Many of the effects that came from the social development of the Gothic style were the more light within the churches. The examples you can see here are the pointed arches in that allow for longer, taller columns and thinner columns also. And then they also used stained glass windows and thinner walls. As I mentioned before, culturally, the Gothic era was also influenced by the Islamic groups that led European architects to use, as I said, pointed arches, thinner walls, and decorative details that solved structural challenges. Now they could have more weight supported into the columns instead of using the round arches as before. It made space for more light and could be elongated vertically, and it gave more sophistications and symbolism throughout
through the use of ornamentation in the architecture. And Abbot Suger wanted the cathedrals to use all of the ornamentation necessary to show the wealth and to show the light, to show the symbolism that God is light. And he declared that everything that is most precious should be used above all to celebrate the Holy Mass. Politically, there was a new French monarchy that came into power, and it was seen as peaceful and prosperous, which is how buildings were able to be built more carefully, taking more time, and also larger and more expansive than ever before, with more ornamentation like the stained glass windows with gems showing and advertising the wealth of the people. Economically, the Gothic era was also influenced by the increased population, which led to the growth of cities. They were experiencing more trade, which built up the economy, and they had universities that were being established and built in the Gothic style, and it also was influenced by the urbanization of the people. As the new French monarchy came into power, there were new agricultural innovations that led people to move away from the agricultural region to the more urban regions, and that's where they were building massive cathedrals in order to house these people and to bring them together, but also to show the extensive wealth and the power that the church had over the region at the time.
Romanesque to Gothic architecture. Romanesque architecture had very few windows, narrow vaults, massive pillars, and massive walls. It was an overall bulkier type of architecture. Gothic architecture had large windows, pointed arches, ribbed vaulting, and many more characteristics, but these are the ones I'm going to talk about today. The push from Romanesque to Gothic was not a huge leap, but a slow progress over time. The transition started as architects explored ways to achieve greater heights and incorporate greater amounts of natural light. One of the big transitions we see from Romanesque to Gothic are rounded arches to pointed arches. Rounded arches are very strong, but bulky. They allow for very little windows. This is a big contributing factor to why architects started looking for other ways. Pointed arches become such a big part of Gothic architecture because they are stable and large at very large heights. They do not require very thick walls, and they span out a lot more than rounded arches do, allowing for larger window openings. Another change from Romanesque to Gothic architecture is the transition from barrow vaults to ribbed vaults. The two big reasons for the switch were barrow vaults limited natural light, and they were not suitable for large spans. As architects looked for a way to incorporate more natural light, they discovered ribbed vaults. Ribbed vaults allowed them to have longer spans of coverage as they distributed loads evenly. They also allowed thinner walls and larger windows while keeping structural integrity.